So what you just heard were the last two pieces of the next slide, which was the overview of what we're going to talk about, the Kentucky legislative session, Homestead in Kentucky. I'm going to touch briefly on some federal, kind of recent pieces of federal legislation that were bipartisan, trying to read the tea leaves of where is Congress headed on a bipartisan basis in the area of disability policy, and what might we expect from the next administration in the area of disability policy, building on things that happened during the last two terms of the Obama administration. And just to share a little bit of my background, I'm a disability rights lawyer by training. I have bipolar disorder myself, so I would consider myself one of the disabled people that Jeff wants to be in leadership. And I think of myself as a second generation disability activist because I graduated law school in 1990, which was the year that Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I've kind of inherited a mantle of a civil rights law and a civil rights movement. And then during the time that I've been, a professional working in this field, another generation of young people with disabilities have come of age. Senator Harkin referred to them as the ADA generation. And they make me hopeful and optimistic in terms of both the folks with disabilities and without disabilities who were part of that generation. I feel like there's high expectations. There's a lot of interest in that generation in intersectionality between disability status and racial identity or sexual orientation or other. And I think that leads to creative coalition building opportunities that we haven't always seen in our space or in the broader civil rights or diversity space. So just quickly in terms of some of the recent developments at the federal level, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act is a big piece of federal legislation that reauthorized a bunch of workforce development programs at the federal level, including but not limited to the vocational rehabilitation program. It was reauthorized with very bipartisan votes in the Senate and the House in July of 2014. Does anybody know when the last time that law had been reauthorized? 1998, and that was supposed to be a 5-year reauthorization. So from 2003 to 2014, a series of chairs and ranking members of the Senate Health Committee and their counterparts in the House, which was the Education and the Workforce Committee. Is their phone ringing? Okay. Okay, no problem. Are we good? Yes, sir. Great. So a series of senators, including Senator Kennedy when he was still alive, Senator Enzi, who was the ranking member and then the chair of the committee, and then Harkin and Alexander worked on reauthorizing the bill. We can just stop for a second and figure it out. There's no rush.
I did. They're trying to sound check. We can also put them on computer because they would go to a computer. We can look at it too. The Adobe's running. We have 2 offsites: Kentucky Utilities and Coldstream.
So you're saying we're losing one of the offsites?
The Adobe is running fine.
Now they lost me completely. That's all right.
We can also have them watch the computer as well.
Well,
at their site.
Several of them lost, I'm sure.
They can go to their office too. Talking about a couple of
We have plenty of time, so don't stress out. Well, I'm thinking it's better to just stop for a second.
I'm really sorry.
That's true. But the Adobe is running super. I mean, they could go.
So do you want to just like announce that we're going to?
I can ask the participants at the Kentucky Utilities Building in Coldstream to move to a person's office who's watching it online for now, and we can continue as is because the Adobe is running.
Okay.
There we go. We got them all back.
Okay, great.
Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. So, Harold, we're going to start up.
Content again.
You guys, raise your hand if you can hear me in the other rooms. Great.
We can hear you, but we need there we go.
Got it. This is totally the fault of the HDI social media.
And then, I don't know, do you care about the video feed?
We don't want to run too much video because it pulls
Okay.
on bandwidth.
Okay, no
But
problem.
We'll bring you back.
No problem, no
We'll
problem.
bring you back.
So again, in terms of the workforce innovation opportunity, it was a long time with a lot of bipartisan effort, able to get it passed in 2014. And the bill, like the big message of this bill is that vocational rehabilitation needs to pay attention to young people with disabilities and needs to have high expectations for young people with disabilities, including young people with significant disabilities. So the bill for the first time requires the state vocational rehabilitation agency to spend at least 15% of their state budget for vocational rehabilitation on young people in transition. That's the first time there's been a requirement for that. Some state agencies, and I don't know what the history in Kentucky has been, but some state agencies had a history of spending more than that. It's a floor, not a ceiling. But many agencies were not spending 15%. The theory on the bipartisan basis of the legislators who worked on the bill, and I was working for Senator Harkin when we were negotiating the provisions in the bill, the theory was that for people with lifelong disabilities or childhood onset disabilities, if vocational rehabilitation can get involved with them while they're still in school and help them have a successful employment experience while they're still in school, which we just heard the research that supports this, then they're more likely to have success in the labor force when they leave school. And if VR says, well, come see us when you graduate, we're missing the opportunity to tap into the expertise of VR and the resources of the public vocational rehabilitation program to help get a young person on a trajectory that could lead to competitive integrated employment.
Well, we'll talk to you in Kentucky 6 months before you graduate, so you don't have to get all the way to the end. We'll talk to you soon.
And the bill definitely pushes in the direction of starting earlier than that. But I understand that that's been difficult for some folks in VR to embrace. Yeah. I think some folks in VR feel like education is the job of schools. VR is not an entitlement program. IDEA is an entitlement program. So if you expect VR to get in the business of serving young people while they still have their IDEA entitlement, you're asking VR to do something that they don't have the resources to do. And our response to that is, you're going to be serving these folks after they graduate anyway. Why not spend the money where you can get the best return on the investment? Yeah. So the good news from my perspective is that this was very bipartisan, and many of the Republicans who worked on this bill are still in Congress and still have important roles on these committees. So they've basically said, we got to start early, and we need to have high expectations for young people. And there's a provision in the bill that was very hard to negotiate, and I referred to it earlier, where Senator Harkin wanted to make it harder for young people to get tracked from school into a sheltered workshop or a center-based setting or whatever people want to call it in Kentucky. So what we did is we said, if a young person shows up at a center-based setting, they need to show the people that run that setting that they have applied for services from vocational rehabilitation and they have made a reasonable effort at competitive integrated employment before they would be considered eligible to work in any other setting. The reason that Senator Harkin was comfortable with that as a compromise, it's not what he wanted, but he ultimately was comfortable with that, is he saw it as a kick in the pants in the direction of competitive integrated employment. And his theory was, if a young person had an opportunity to experience a competitive work environment, most young people would not choose to work in a segregated work environment. But if they never had an opportunity to experience competitive employment, we don't know what they would choose. So that was the theory behind it. That was a very controversial provision. The National Disability Rights Network and the National Council on Independent Living, both of whom do not like sheltered workshops, supported that as a compromise step in the right direction. Other groups like the National Federation of the Blind opposed it, ultimately got behind the bill later in the process. And then other groups like TASH or APSI, I don't think they ever got behind that, although many of them would acknowledge now that they're trying to leverage that provision to push reforms that they've been trying to push at the state level for many years. So that's kind of at a very high level, what's in WIOA, and then I think we can all think together about what are the implications of that for other areas of federal policy. We heard a reference to the ABLE Act earlier. This is another relatively recent federal, very bipartisan piece of legislation that passed in December of 2014. The leadership on the ABLE Act was bipartisan, but the real leadership on it was all Republican. It was Anders Crenshaw in the House who really got behind it from Florida. And then there were some parents, relatively young parents of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, like Kathy McMorris Rogers, like Pete Sessions. Kathy McMorris Rogers is from Washington State. She's the highest ranking Republican woman in the House. Pete Sessions is from Texas, Dallas area, and he's the chair of the House Rules Committee, which is one of the most powerful positions in the House. Every bill that goes through the U.S. House of Representatives has to go through the Rules Committee. And then Greg Harper from Mississippi was the other parent who got very involved. And the whole point of the ABLE Act was to use a tax provision that allows for college savings accounts. Some people have heard of the 529 savings accounts. To use that provision to let parents of young people with lifelong disabilities set aside money that their young people can tap into as adults without losing their eligibility for Medicaid or SSI or other, long-term services supports that they're going to need. What's exciting to me about the ABLE Act, in order for it to be implemented, states have to pass implementing legislation, and that's why Kentucky is working on their bill. Ohio passed a bill. The first ABLE account got opened in Ohio last week. So we're starting to see these things happen. I think at least 35 states have an ABLE bill somewhere in the process. And the bipartisan work that happened at the federal level is also happening at the state level. By the way, the Democrats who supported ABLE and played a leadership role included Chris Van Hollen in the House, who's running to replace Barbara Mikulski in the Maryland Senate in a very tight Democratic primary. He's somebody that I really see as a rising star on disability issues if he makes it through this primary. And it's very close. He's running against an African-American woman in Maryland who is doing very well. And I don't know how the election will come out. His opponent's name is Donna Edwards. They're both incumbent House members in Maryland. And then the lead Democrat in the Senate was Senator Casey from Pennsylvania, who is on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and I think has the potential to pick up some of the mantle from Senator Harkin and Senator Kennedy in terms of being a strong voice for people with disabilities on that committee. But to me, what's exciting about ABLE, I mean, it's a real thing for people that have money that enables them to help their young person as they become an adult have more choice in their lives and a better life experience, a better quality of life than a lot of people are able to have when they're on SSI and Medicaid, which has lots of restrictions around how much money you can have in the bank, et cetera.
Kentucky did pass legislation. The governor signed the legislation about 2 weeks ago, and it was bipartisan. It was a Republican senator and a Democratic representative. But Kentucky's legislation only enables Kentuckians to open accounts in other states. So you will not be harmed. your need-tested benefits will not be harmed if you open an ABLE account, but Kentucky itself is not going to have any program. The next step for Kentucky is for a kind of a coalition to get together with our state treasurer to determine whether it's feasible for Kentucky to open its own place.
So were the people at remote locations able to hear that? Should I repeat that?
You should probably repeat that.
So there was a comment from the legislative person from the DD Council. Tell me your name again. Stephanie Adams. That the bill that passed in Kentucky was a compromise bill where it did pass, and it is law in Kentucky, but the compromise for now is that you can open an ABLE account in Kentucky if you open it in another state, and they're still working on what they need to do to enable people to open an ABLE account in Kentucky. So this could be good for banks in Cincinnati, presumably, or other places that are close to Kentucky. So to me, what's interesting about the ABLE account or about the ABLE Act is, again, very bipartisan. I think Kathy McMorris Rogers, Pete Sessions, some of these folks who worked on it enjoyed working on it, feel like it was a major accomplishment, and are like thinking about what else can we do that will make a difference for our children with disabilities as they become adults. What they're upset about and why they were attracted to the ABLE Act is the expectation that their young people are not going to work, their expectation that their young people are going to live in poverty. They don't like what adulthood looks like for a typical adult with Down syndrome or autism or other kind of intellectual and developmental disability. And they want to find a way around these major entitlement programs that have put all these restrictions on what people with disabilities can do as adults. That gets me excited because I feel like there's a lot more we can do. The ABLE Act to me is a camel's nose under the tent. There's a lot more we can do to modernize our big entitlement programs. If you think about the programs that are the big money programs that serve children and adults with disabilities, we're talking about Medicaid, Medicare, Supplemental Security Income or SSI, and Social Security Disability Insurance. What do you have to prove to the government in order to get in the front door of these programs? You have to prove that you have a physical or mental condition that's going to last at least 12 months or result in death, that's going to prevent you from engaging in substantial gainful activity. That eligibility definition in the Social Security Act, which applies to SSI and SSDI, and then by extension to Medicaid and Medicare, is a 1956 definition. So in 1956, we decided that the way we would figure out if somebody has a significant disability, significant enough that they deserve a check from the government and support from the government, is we would draw a direct correlation between the medical nature of their condition and their ability to have success in the labor market. That is not modern thinking about disability. So my hope, none of this is going to be easy, but my hope is that the same kind of bipartisan creative work that went into the ABLE Act will start to say to states, and Kentucky could be one of them, come up with a better way to identify people with significant disabilities. Let's test it out, and then let's use that to change the federal definition. I don't think we can change the federal definition without testing a new definition at the state level, but I do think there'll be a number of Republican and Democratic governors who might like the idea, again, using the same ABLE coalition, like the idea of testing a definition that doesn't connect disability with inability to work. So that's my excitement about the ABLE Act in terms of potential future direction. The other bill that I wanted to briefly mention, which is the most recent one, is the Every Student Succeeds Act. Now, this is the new name for No Child Left Behind. Before it was called No Child Left Behind, it was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this is the piece of federal legislation that tries to govern how federal money that's supposed to support poor and disadvantaged children is going to be spent. And in No Child Left Behind, do we need to do something? I didn't mean to.
Thank you.
Yeah. in No Child Left Behind, the concept, and this was coming from President Bush, Bush the second, and the concept was, we as a federal government need to have more accountability with the states, and we need to kind of create a system where schools who are failing their children get punished for that, and eventually go away, so that children go to schools that can get better outcomes for those children. Senator Kennedy worked with President Bush on the bill because he thought this idea of No Child Left Behind, which was stolen from the Children's Defense Fund, was great policy, and he thought, well, let's get the kind of federal requirements in place, and then we can come back and create a budget that will support these requirements, and the budget never happened. So people can argue about whether No Child Left Behind had some positive impact. I would argue for kids with disabilities, we have much better data about how they're doing compared to kids without disabilities than we had before No Child Left Behind, and we've been able to use that in our advocacy at the state level and at the federal level. But the bottom line is, No Child Left Behind had enemies everywhere. There were people who thought it was a federal government overreach. I'm sure that was a theme in Kentucky. Why is the federal government telling us how to educate our children? There were folks on the left who thought that it was meaningless because there was no budget supporting it. There were lots of people on the left and right who thought that the high stakes testing was making the teachers focus exclusively on the tests. Within the disability world, we got into issues around alternatives to the test and how many kids should be able to have an alternative, way of measuring adequate progress academically. There was just a lot of concerns with the details of how the law was implemented. So the bipartisan compromise for this new law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which Lamar Alexander negotiated with the new ranking Democrat on the Health Committee, Patty Murray from Washington State, was that we're going to still have accountability, but we're going to leave it up to Kentucky what that accountability looks like for kids with disabilities. So Kentucky cannot elect to not measure progress for kids with disabilities. That's not an option under this new law, but they can decide how to measure progress for kids with disabilities. So if you think about that from an advocacy perspective in Kentucky, you have an interest in being involved in helping the state figure that out. You also have an interest in seeing what other states are doing and trying to take the best models that we can find from other states and try to make them happen in Kentucky. And if there are good models in Republican states, that'll probably be more valuable in your advocacy in Kentucky than a good model in one of these liberal states that Kentucky doesn't always look to for leadership. Again, what is the Every Student Succeeds Act in terms of looking to the future? What's exciting to me about this bill is there was a big fight around this bill, around whether we were going to even have accountability for kids with disabilities, for Latino kids, for African American kids. That fight was called subgroup accountability. Will we ultimately be able to see how schools are doing for subpopulations that are at risk of being underserved or poorly served by schools? And the entire Civil Rights Coalition hung together and got a bipartisan consensus with Congress that yes, we're not going to give up on subgroup accountability, but we are going to push it down to the state level. If that coalition that worked together on the bill can work together at the state level on implementing the bill, that's very exciting to me, because in education policy, I don't know what it's been like in Kentucky, but we haven't always seen all of the civil rights advocates working together on accountability. And obviously there are lots of kids with disabilities who are also African American, Latino, et cetera. So to me, that kind of coalition can lead to good things at the state level and the federal level moving forward. I think the last topic that we wanted to touch on, and then we are going to open it up and we have plenty of time to really have a discussion, is the Supreme Court. So I think everybody here knows that we have an opening on the Supreme Court. There are 9 justices that are called for in the Constitution. Justice Scalia, who had been on the court for a long time and was a very important thought leader on the conservative end of the court, died unexpectedly. Your senator, within hours of Justice Scalia's death.
I think he's the senator elected from
Yes,
Kentucky.
Okay. I'm sorry, that's an important clarification. The senator elected from Kentucky, within hours of Justice Scalia's death, said that he thought we should let the election determine who is going to be the next justice on the Supreme Court. And President Obama did not agree with that. Within hours, he had a different perspective, and he did go ahead and nominate somebody for the open position, Merrick Garland, who's probably a pretty moderate current sitting judge. I think he's the head judge of the D.C. Circuit right now, but he's hard to pigeonhole ideologically. He's, from a disability standpoint, he's had some good decisions from our perspective, and he's had some decisions that we wouldn't necessarily point to as a model. But we had an opportunity to say if we had a serious problem with him as a community, and we did not object to his name being put forward. But the bottom line is we now have a nominee. We have a judiciary committee under the leadership of Chairman Grassley from Iowa. By the way, Senator Harkin was in the Senate for 30 years. During that time, Senator Grassley was in the Senate for, I think 6 months longer. So the whole time Senator Harkin was in the Senate from Iowa, he was the junior senator from Iowa, which is just kind of funny. It got funnier over time. But at any rate, Senator Grassley, who has been the senior senator from Iowa for a long time, has not agreed to have a hearing. The issue is polling in a way where more and more Americans think that there should be a hearing. I don't know if that will matter to Chairman Grassley or to Leader McConnell. But I just wanted to touch briefly on why do we care, from a disability standpoint. And this is something I've thought a lot about. Under the Rehnquist court, when Chief Justice Rehnquist was the Chief Justice, the court did a lot of, had a number of decisions that did harm to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that interpreted the Constitution in a way that made it a very weak tool to support disability rights. Probably the constitutional interpretations are more important than the legislative interpretations. We actually were able to overturn a lot of the bad legislative interpretations in 2008. On a very bipartisan basis, Congress passed the HDI Amendments Act, which overturned 4 Supreme Court decisions. And the fact that it was really bipartisan and President Bush signed it just tells you how bad those decisions were. Because it wasn't like people didn't like those. There were people who liked those decisions, but when we got up in Congress and started debating it, they were losing because the decisions were hard to defend. But I just want to touch on the constitutional piece. So there was a case called Garrett where a nurse had gone out of work for chemotherapy. Patricia Garrett was her name. She came back to work and she got demoted. She had a pretty important job in the hospital and she was working for the state of Alabama. And she used the Americans with Disabilities Act to challenge the demotion. And the issue in the case ended up being whether Congress had the authority under the ADA to give her the right to sue the state of Alabama for money damages for discriminating against her. And it was a 5-4 decision. But the majority in the court had ultimately interpreted the Constitution to say Congress went beyond their authority under the Constitution to give her the right to sue the state of Alabama, because in order to have that right, the state of Alabama would have to have had a history of unconstitutional discrimination against people with disabilities in employment in order for Congress to have the authority to give her the right to sue. And Chief Justice Rehnquist, arguing, writing on behalf of the majority, said that because it's rational to discriminate against people with disabilities, it's not unconstitutional. I mean, it's a mind-blowing decision, and there's a great dissent. I encourage people to read the dissent from Justice Breyer. And Justice Breyer talked a lot about what is the role of the Supreme Court to decide whether history is problematic enough to justify congressional action. And he made the point that Congress has the ability to hold hearings. They have the ability to meet with constituents. They can learn about the history and how it's played out, and then they can act based on that knowledge. The Supreme Court gets none of that. They're very far removed from the history. And Justice Breyer said that the majority in Garrett was treating Congress like they were a lower court, and saying what you did, all those hearings, all the history that you have documented didn't pass our test. We're not going to tell you what would have passed our test, but what you did didn't pass our test, in part because in our minds, discriminating against disabled people in employment is rational. So it was a really, really offensive decision, 5-4, and it hasn't been overturned. And it can't be overturned by an act of Congress. It can be overturned by a more enlightened Supreme Court. And I would argue, if you compare disability jurisprudence with civil rights jurisprudence, we're still waiting for a Brown versus Board of Education in the disability arena. Some people like to refer to the Olmstead case that Jeff talked about as a Brown versus Board of Education case for us. The reason I don't see it that way is the Supreme Court decision in Olmstead was actually a pretty weak decision. The 11th Circuit decision was much stronger. The holding in the 11th Circuit gave the state much fewer things that they could argue to get out of serving people in the community, and the district court decision was even stronger. The state basically had no choice but to serve people in the community if the district court decision had become the law of the land. So that's why, Olmstead came down in '99. 17 years later, we still have states that are spending over 80% of their long-term services and supports budgets on segregated institutional settings. So from my perspective, we have an evenly divided court right now. There's an opportunity to replace one of the most conservative justices with a moderate, and I have some hope that Merrick Garland, with these 4 more progressive justices, could actually give us a much more robust interpretation of the Constitution, which will protect Congress's authority to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities. So I know some of that was probably very lawyerly, and I'm happy to try to clarify in the Q&A. But the bottom line is, I feel like there's nothing more important for people with disabilities over the long term, by looking at 40-year trajectory, than having a Supreme Court that fundamentally understands the connection between civil rights for people with disabilities and civil rights for African American children, civil rights for the LGBT community, which the Supreme Court has been much better on, civil rights for women, civil rights for all these other constituencies. And I do think we have a unique opportunity right now to make that kind of progress. So I will stop there. Do you want to add anything before we open it up?
No, thank you.